Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday, October 1st. I'm Brandis Friedman. Coming up on Chicago Tonight, strike threats from the Park District and others, the story behind a recovered photo archive from World War II, and a new project that hopes to take Voyagers to Mars. But first tonight, we're following the impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump. A short while ago, I spoke with PBS NewsHour White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor and began by asking her about Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's letter to the House Foreign Affairs Committee today.
The Secretary Pompeo is essentially saying that House Democrats are bullying his staff and bullying State Department officials, and he's saying that they don't have enough time to get prepared for the depositions the House Democrats want to hold. So he's saying they need more time to hire their own personal attorneys, and essentially it's not feasible for them to hold these depositions this week. Now, that being said, Secretary Pompeo, it seems, isn't saying I'm not going to have these officials have these depositions. So it's still unclear whether or not that's a hard no. House Democrats and others are definitely taking that as a hard no and are definitely criticizing him for trying to stop these officials from testifying and from having these depositions. But we'll have to see how this plays out.
Now, meanwhile, Secretary of State Pompeo, he left for a week-long trip to Europe last night.
Yes. So he is, at this point, out of the country. So he's sending this letter. And in some ways, House Democrats are saying, look, you're emailing us this and basically making this public, but what we really need is State Department officials to show up in Congress and answer our questions. And it's still unclear whether or not that's going to happen. There are already some depositions scheduled with State Department officials this month, so it seems as though those depositions are going to go forward. But Secretary Pompeo is essentially saying, I don't like the way the House Democrats are handling this.
And yesterday, we also learned that Secretary of State, again, Pompeo, was part of that July 25th call that President Trump had with Ukrainian President Zelensky, correct?
Yes, and essentially, I talked to the White House about this. I said, is this big news that Secretary Pompeo was on the call when President Trump is alleged to have pressured the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden for his own political gain? And the White House essentially says it's not a big deal for the Secretary of State to be on the phone when the president is on the phone with a head of state from another country. That said, there are a lot of people, critics of the president, who say if Secretary Pompeo was on that call, he should have said that a long time ago, and he should have said, look, I was on the call, there was nothing wrong with the call was perfect, as President Trump has been saying. Instead, Secretary Pompeo did not divulge that information.
Meanwhile, the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, give us an update on his situation. He canceled what was supposed to be a paid appearance at a Kremlin-sponsored conference.
He did. And also, I was just literally texting with Rudy Giuliani a few moments ago, and he has now hired his own personal attorney to represent him with these congressional inquiries. He's been subpoenaed by House Democrats to provide documents related to his dealings with Ukraine. The whistleblower says that he was a, quote, central figure in the president's alleged attempt to pressure Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. And I said, and I put the question directly to Rudy Giuliani, are you planning to comply with that subpoena? He texted me back one word, studying. So it's unclear whether or not he's actually going to try to fight that subpoena that House Democrats have now issued.
Now, what's the latest on the revelations that President Trump has also pressed other foreign leaders to help with investigating his personal political interests? For example, asking the Australian Prime Minister for help investigating the Mueller inquiry.
So the Department of Justice and the White House are essentially saying that Attorney General Barr was tasked with trying to find out anything he could about the 2016 election and about Robert Mueller's investigation. And the White House is saying this has all really been out in the open. Everyone should understand that Attorney General Barr is going to be working on this. But there are, of course, critics of the president who say this is just another attempt by President Trump to pressure a foreign leader for his own political gain, because he wants to be able to say, I was not helped by Russia. And in fact, this Mueller investigation was a witch hunt, which, of course, most House Democrats and most Democrats say is not exactly the way that it should be put.
And Yamiche, we're also hearing that Attorney General William Barr has traveled abroad to meet with foreign leaders about help looking into CIA and FBI activities in 2016.
That's correct. And what this really is about at this point is the president saying, I cannot trust my own agencies and that I need to actually investigate people who usually do the investigating. So there are critics of the president and critics of Attorney General Barr who are saying that Attorney General Barr is acting as the president's personal attorney in these matters and not as the chief law enforcement official in the country. That being said, I had long conversations with White House aides today, and White House aides are backing up the president and saying this is what Attorney General Barr should be doing. He should be looking into the activities of all of the agencies and also should be looking into the activities, they say, of the 2016 election. So the White House is saying that there is nothing there that is nefarious or anything that would be unethical.
All right, PBS NewsHour's Yamiche Alcindor there in D.C. for us. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
And in just a moment, we'll hear from two local analysts here in the studio. But first, we turn to Congressman Krishnamoorthy, a Democrat who serves on the House Intelligence Committee, one of the committees that's leading the inquiry. Now, we spoke just a short while ago. I began by asking him about the next steps that he expects his committee will take in the coming weeks.
Well, as you know, we now have a whistleblower complaint, and we have an Inspector General's report, and we had a hearing last week. Now we have to talk to more witnesses. First of all, we've asked for depositions of certain State Department officials who would be knowledgeable about whether or not the president actually pressured the Ukrainian leader to meddle in our 2020 elections. The next person that we need to talk to is the whistleblower. We need to bring this person before us and hear firsthand from him or her as to why they did what they did and what additional information they have.
Now, there's also been reporting that President Trump has asked the Australian Prime Minister and some other foreign leaders to help with an investigation into the origins of the Mueller investigation. How concerned are you about these additional conversations on top of the Ukraine call?
I'm very concerned. I think that this investigation of the investigation that Mr. Mueller had launched is misplaced in the first place. But secondly, I'm concerned that the president is again going to try to use his leverage to try to get foreign leaders to do things that they would not otherwise do. And we have tremendous leverage with regard to some of these governments, and I am concerned. I guess the third thing I would say is that, you know, the Department of Justice and the State Department should be independent sections of the executive branch. The fact that the president would somehow commandeer Justice Department investigations for his personal political advantage is deeply troubling.
Now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today has called requests by House Democrats to interview diplomats. He says that they amount to, quote, intimidation. What's your reaction to that?
No, I think that is wrong. I think that we must talk to these people because they've been named in the complaint for the most part. They have knowledge potentially about the substance of these allegations. If Mr. Pompeo is going to block the evidence gathering process, he should remember that this is an impeachment inquiry, and his efforts to block evidence gathering would be obstruction of an impeachment inquiry, and therefore would invite the inference that any blocked testimony would likely corroborate or be consistent with the whistleblower testimony.
And almost every Republican in Congress remains loyal to President Trump. Do you see any signs of that changing as this inquiry continues?
I think that the other day in the hearing with Acting Director of National Intelligence McGuire, I did hear Congressman Turner of Ohio, a Republican, say in open session he did not think the transcript of the July 25th, 2019 call that President Trump made to President Zelensky, was okay, that it was not proper, it was not something that the American people would like to see their president doing. I think that others say these things privately. I'd like to hear them say this publicly. We're also seeing public sentiment shift with regard to this impeachment inquiry, in part because of the seriousness of the allegations. I hope the Republicans pay attention. We have to conduct this investigation in a nonpartisan or objective manner.
Congressman Krishnamoorthy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brandis.
As you just heard again, that was Illinois Congressman Krishnamoorthy. We also invited every House Republican from Illinois, plus Republicans from southern Wisconsin and northwest Indiana. They all either declined our invitation or did not respond. Now, joining us here in the studio to share their take on the latest developments on the impeachment inquiry are John Dane, Faculty Director of Loyola University Chicago's National Security and Civil Rights Program, and cylce, a former member of the U.S. Foreign Service and current Senior Fellow on Security and Diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome back to Chicago Tonight.
Thank you.
So, John Dane, let's start with you. There are now reports that President Trump has asked other foreign leaders to help his administration to investigate the Mueller report and the source of that report, including the Prime Minister of Australia. How does that compare with the Ukraine call, which is the one at the center of this impeachment inquiry?
I do think it's important to distinguish between the two. One involves an official U.S. investigation, the premises of which are questionable, as many have already commented. But that is an official U.S. investigation. It is appropriate for people from the U.S. government to interact with foreign governments related to that investigation. And in this case, given the unique nature of the investigation, it's not really surprising that high-level officials would become involved, especially if they're seeking intelligence-sensitive information, in which case the foreign governments may be reluctant to give that without speaking to the highest level officials of the U.S. government. Given this administration's history with classified information, they may be more reluctant than they have been in the past.
cylce, how do you see this?
Yeah, so I agree. The phone call with the Ukrainian president was on a different level in a whole number of ways, starting with the very clear quid pro quo that money that Ukraine desperately needed, armaments, would not be released unless Zelensky did some things that the president was asking him to do. There were other aspects of that call, bashing the previous U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, and just some really inappropriate comments by the president, and that make the entire conversation really troubling. And you start wondering, well, what other conversations are there out there? And I think that's probably what some people in the White House are worried about right now. There's supposedly a vault full of other memoranda of conversations and recordings of these phone calls that have not seen the light of day for the most part. And I'm really wondering what we're going to find when Congress finally gets its hand on some of those. And I think that it eventually will get its hands on some of those. Yeah.
The administration claims that the president's actions on his call with the president of Ukraine fall within his constitutional authority. Fair assessment?
Well, the president certainly has broad discretion to conduct the foreign affairs of the nation. The question is that what that call was about? The same questions pertain to Giuliani's involvement in this. Was he acting as a representative of the nation? Was he acting as a representative of the president in his official capacity, or was he acting as a personal representative of the president? And those are important questions that we need to get to the bottom of so that we can decide what his role in this really was. There are things such as private agents that presidents can assign to do specific tasks. I know my colleague here is familiar with them, but it's not at all clear that that's what this was. And it seems to be clear that Mr. Giuliani wants to claim that he was one of these agents because he suggested he was working with the State Department for the State Department, but then in other interviews makes different claims. So it's really hard to assess without having more information.
Does Rudy Giuliani's involvement in Ukraine, does that sort of, does it make what the president was doing on the phone with the president of Ukraine, is that what kind of muddies the waters here? Like, had Rudy Giuliani not gotten involved, would this be a lot more clear?
I don't know if it would be clear or not, but it's just a whole other layer in this really strange story overall. As John just said, you know, Kurt Volker, who is one of the people who just resigned a few days ago, is one of the 5 people who was supposed to be deposed on the Hill next week. He was not being paid to do his job. So what John was referring to, which is that there can be private agents, but they still are treated like employees. They have to put all of their assets in a blind trust, and they swear an oath to the Constitution. It's not clear that Giuliani was that, and it's not really clear at all that anybody else in the U.S. government knew what Rudy Giuliani was up to other than the president himself. So I think, in a way, frankly, that some of the things Giuliani's been saying the last few days are actually making things worse for President Trump, because it makes it appear that there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than people even know about at this point.
John Dane, also at the center of the impeachment inquiry, it's the information of the classification system, the information classification system, which was used to store the record of President Trump's Ukraine call. Legally, how are these systems supposed to be used?
Well, There's many federal regulations that deal with classified information and how it's supposed to be handled and processed. The fundamental rule is things should be classified at the lowest level possible. There is a tremendous problem with overclassification in the government, military, State Department, all agencies really. But the fundamental rule is that you're supposed to classify at the lowest level possible. It's not clear to me why then they would move this information, which is normally not classified at a highly sensitive level, into a highly sensitive classified server. There could be reasons that would be legitimate, but if the goal was to hide that information from investigators or to cover up misdeeds by the president, that would certainly be a misuse of the system.
What or who determines the level of classification of documents?
So in the government, you have something called original classification authorities that assign the level of classification to the documents. We've recently seen evidence of this with the State Department reclassifying some of the old emails from the Secretary Clinton's time, and now investigating matters related to those. So original classification authorities are responsible for determining that level of classification. Of course, the president also, the classification is the president's tool, and so the president has a lot of say in how things might be classified as well.
But the reason that you classify things at the lowest level possible is because the idea in a government is sharing information is good. You know, if your CEO has a conversation with another company about a coming merger, let's say, he doesn't want to hide that information from the key people. He needs the key people to know what's going on. He doesn't need superfluous people to know what's going on, but he needs key people to know what's going on. And what's becoming clear is that key people in the policy process have been kept out of the loop of what the president is discussing with these leaders.
So cylce, you also served in several countries as part of the Foreign Service. How do you think the president's actions here will impact the effectiveness of ambassadors and other diplomats abroad?
I mean, it's really troubling on three different levels. First of all, I personally think it was a mistake to release the memorandum of conversation. I think they should have perhaps released it to some members of Congress and then released the whistleblowers report more broadly. I understand why they did. They felt like they needed to squash rumors about what was in it. But if you're anybody, certainly a world leader, but really anybody representing a foreign government, now you're going to think 4 times before you have an honest conversation with an American if you think that the telegram or the memorandum on that conversation is going to be released to the press. And so that's really damaging to our diplomats' ability, and our military people also, to their ability to do their job with foreign officials. The flip side of that is, you know, the information that is particularly in the Zelensky call of the president bashing his own employees and saying really inappropriate and you could say sexually charged things about his own ambassador, Masha Yovanovitch, it's just appalling. And why would anyone want to be a U.S. ambassador? Why would anyone want to take that job now, knowing that they could face hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal bills and having their name you know, run through the mud like this? So that's really troubling. And then the third part is just we're seeing an exodus of really good people. They're hitting the age of retirement and they're just leaving, or they just aren't sticking around. And so I worry about the health of the Foreign Service and the Civil Service 10, 15, 20 years from now, because so many people are leaving at this point. I don't know if you've seen the same thing in the military, but...
Fortunately, I've been out of the military for quite some time.
Yeah. All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much to John Dane and cylce for joining us.
Thank you.
There is more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so please stay with us.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by North Shore University Health System.
What does it mean to care for someone? To heal? At North Shore, we're driven to understand bodies on a molecular level. But to truly treat you, we need to listen to what you say and what you don't say. Only by understanding you, inside and out, can our team of specialists determine the best path of care for you. We call it the science of understanding, and that's healthcare for what's next.
Efforts to get more participation in the 2020 census are growing, but it comes with a price tag. Paris Schutz has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Paris.
Brandon's Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot says she wants as many residents as possible to be counted in the 2020 census and that it's going to require some work. The mayor today pledged $2.7 million to the effort, which will include an outreach campaign, especially to get those in so-called hard-to-reach communities. Lightfoot says the city achieved a meager 66% participation rate in the last census and says tens of billions of federal dollars are at stake.
The inclusion of every Chicagoan is essential to the 2020 census count. And over the next several months, our team will be working hard to ensure that all residents, let me underscore, all residents, even in the hardest to reach places, have the information and the comfort that they need to participate.
Meanwhile, police officials say Chicago violence is trending downward slightly. Statistics revealed today show that there have been 382 murders this year compared to 429 for the same period last year. CPD says some shootings are also down and overall crime is down 9%.
The technology is certainly helping. We're improving our relationship all the time with the community. We've got some incredible advances as far as our community relations, and that helps provide information to officers that leads to solving crimes.
Reports this evening give new insight into what the FBI was looking for in its raid last week of the offices of Democratic State Senator Martin Sandoval. According to the Sun-Times and Tribune, a federal search warrant sought information related to unnamed lobbyists, Illinois Department of Transportation officials, a construction company official, and highway company officials. Authorities were also seeking any items that would show an official government action taken in exchange for a private benefit. The federal raids were carried out last Tuesday, and 2 days later, federal authorities raided municipal government buildings in the suburbs of McCook, Lyons, and Summit. The search warrant was released today by the Illinois Senate Democratic Freedom of Information Officer and was heavily redacted. Entrepreneurs who want in on the recreational marijuana business, listen up. As many as 75 licenses to own and operate a dispensary are now up for grabs for those that don't already have a stake in the medical marijuana industry. Applicants must pony up $5,000 non-refundable fee, and the licenses will be given proportionately around the state. The new licenses will be awarded by May 1st of next year. And as for the weather, a chance of showers and thunderstorms tonight, otherwise mostly cloudy with a low around 64. And then tomorrow, showers and storms are likely throughout the day with a more autumn-like high near 63. And now, Brandis, back to you.
Paris, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight. The city of Chicago could be facing multiple government employee strikes all at once. And how one of those strikes, a teacher's strike, would impact school administrators. The head of Chicago's Principals Association joins us. The incredible story behind a recovered photo archive of life during World War II. Could this new prototype Starship one day take human beings to Mars? Entrepreneur Elon Musk sure hopes so. And Get Art, Give Art concept is changing the way one nonprofit gives back. And in tonight's viewer feedback, you shared your nostalgia with us on a story about Chicago's very own souvenir machine, Mold-A-Rama. But first, some of today's top business headlines from Crain's. Here's Ann Dwyer.
Brandis, a key gauge of U.S. manufacturing strength, has registered the lowest reading in more than 10 years as exports dove amid the escalating trade war. The Purchasing Managers Index from the Institute for Supply Management came in today at 47.8% in September. That's the lowest since June 2009, marking the second consecutive month of contraction. Any figure below 50% signals a contraction. After the reports released this morning, Treasury yields plummeted, the dollar erased gains, and U.S. stocks swung to losses. The ISM's employment measure also dropped to the lowest level since January 2016. That's a worrying sign before a jobs report Friday that's forecast to show private payroll growth remains subdued. Meanwhile, Crate and Barrel has plans to bring more than 200 jobs to southwest suburban Romeoville. The furniture and housewares retailer aims to open a massive fulfillment center there to fill orders for its growing online business. The industrial real estate developer Pizzuti will build the Crate and Barrel warehouse in the Pinnacle Business Center, a 900-acre development near Weber Road and Interstate 55. Crate and Barrel, which is headquartered in Northbrook, is expected to start using the fulfillment center in March 2021. And finally, Illinois is joining a handful of other states considering legislation to pressure the NCAA into allowing college athletes to sign endorsement deals. The Illinois bill is modeled after a California initiative that would guarantee athletes the right to profit from their identities, allowing them to sign deals with apparel companies or other businesses. If passed, it would go into effect in 2023, giving the NCAA time to independently change its own rules on a national scale. For Crain's Chicago Business and chicagobusiness.com, I'm Ann Dwyer. Back to you, Brandis.
And thank you. Chicago students have been back in school for about a month, but the threat of a teacher's strike means they could get soon another unscheduled break. There's also the possibility of 2 other strikes by support staff and the Park District. Chicago Tonight's Amanda Vinicky joins me with details. Amanda.
Brandis, we know that Chicago Teachers Union members overwhelmingly voted to strike, but it's official now. The CTU has sent Chicago Public Schools the notice required by law of the union's intent to go on strike. And CPS leaders in return have acknowledged receipt, meaning everything is set in motion for CPS teachers to walk out as soon as Monday. But it's not just teachers. CPS support staff and Chicago Park District employees, both represented by SEIU, also prepped to strike.
We're not asking to get rich. We're not asking for $100,000 jobs. We're asking to be able to live in the city of Chicago.
They amped up the public pressure today, hand delivering strike notices to Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Here's Lightfoot's immediate response.
Let's get the deal done. Let's go 7 days a week. Let's triple, quadruple track, as I've offered many, many times. Willing to be at the table myself. I'm hoping that we're going to have a conversation with SEIU's leader, who has not been directly involved in the discussions, but there's a deal to be had if there's an interest in actually avoiding a strike.
Now, Amanda, we know that the earliest that Chicago teachers can go on strike is, of course, October 7th. What about these other unions?
Their timelines are just a little bit later, and just because Monday is the earliest that teachers can strike doesn't mean they have to do it then, well, or frankly at all. We'll learn what CTU is thinking in terms of timing after a delegates meeting tomorrow evening, and we'll be covering that on Wednesday's program. But it seems as if it is going to be later in October. By all going on strike at the same time, the unions would increase their bargaining leverage.
Yes, we are all looking to potentially strike at the same time, and that's because we are supporting each other, because we're all fighting for the same, virtually the same thing, and we need to stand together.
All striking at the same time, Amanda, what kind of impact could that have?
That could present some problems for Mayor Lightfoot, who is going to, of course, have to outline her budget plans later this month. She ran as both a labor-friendly progressive and a no-nonsense leader who was promised to whip Chicago's finances into shape. Now, beyond potential image issues, there may be material ones. When Chicago teachers last went on strike in 2012, the Park District was refuge for students. Parks offered a strike camp where students could drop in and play dodgeball, floor hockey, do arts and crafts, which of course wouldn't be feasible if Park District employees are not on the job. The mayor says her administration does have a contingency plan in place, but she says there is no reason it should be needed.
This is all part of the process, and we understand that. We are working diligently every single day to get a deal done, but we got to have a willing partner. As I think some of you know, we have put out substantive offers that have been unaddressed, unresponded to now for weeks and going on months. But we're still going to be working really hard at the table. I think we put together great offers, both for CTU, also SEIU.
Now, when it comes to SEIU, the mayor says that its members have chronically been underpaid.
If we are able to strike the deal that on the terms that we propose, you're looking at people getting 7% increases, 9% increases, 15% increases, some of which will be immediate at the time of the signature of the agreement, others which will take place over time. These are very substantial offers.
But so far, school support staff, now you're talking about therapists, special education workers, bus drivers, also Park District workers, say those offers are not enough.
Our work is not intuitive. It takes a skill. It takes a kind-hearted person to educate our students. Our work should be treated with the utmost importance.
We don't want to go on strike, but we have to be able to afford to live in the city that we're required to live in. Amen. We have to be able to pay our bills.
This all comes as Lightfoot is also tasked with reaching a contract with city police. A charter school has authorized a strike. Even the Old Town School of Music negotiations today starting between the school and its newly unionized teachers. Now, Brandis, by the way, depending on if and when particularly the Park District employees go on strike, that could impact the Chicago Marathon, which is October 13th.
A lot to keep an eye on, Amanda. Thank you. Up next, checking in with the head of Chicago's Principals Association and his thoughts on a teacher strike.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by ComEd, powering lives.
We have a tremendous source of untapped, efficient energy right here in our school. Let her rip, Jenny.
I kind of love this idea.
The ComEd Energy Efficiency Program has real ideas for making schools energy efficient.
Pedal faster.
One of the sticking points in ongoing negotiations between the Chicago Teachers Union and Chicago Public Schools is teacher prep time. Paid chunks of time to collaborate with other teachers, work on lesson plans, and talk with parents. Now, CPS last month said it included principals in bargaining sessions to explain the district's position on prep time. Now, the organization that represents many Chicago principals says their views aren't being accurately represented and that principals need a meaningful seat at the table. Joining us to talk about that and more is Troy LaRaviere, president of the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association. Welcome back to Chicago Tonight, Troy.
Good to be here again.
So the district and the teachers union disagree on how much teacher-directed prep time should be in the contract. You said, or CPS said that principals were at the table to help support the district's proposal, but you surveyed principals on this issue. What did you find out?
So context is necessary here. When they were quoted as saying that principals were at the table, many of my members emailed me to say, who's at the table for us? And is the district misrepresenting our position? Now, I had been, over the last 9 months, I had one-on-one meetings with about 100 principals. And one of the first things I asked them is, what do you want us to fight for? And principals talked about understaffing. They talked about the unfairness of SQRP. Some talked about being harassed.
SQRP, the quality
the way that schools are rated.
Yes.
They talked about, unfortunately, several talked about being harassed and intimidated and going through verbal and psychological abuse at the hands of their district supervisors. They talked about Aramark and the custodial company making their lives miserable by not doing its job. They talked about this new Aspen system not working. But one thing that none of them talked about was wanting to convert principal or teacher-directed prep time into principal-directed prep time. And so I wanted to make sure I was representing them accurately.
So you're saying CPS is making the case that this is what principals are saying,
right?
But you found that principals aren't saying that principal-directed prep time is one of their requests.
Right. We put the survey out over 3 days. We got 317 responses, and almost 70% of principals do not or disagree with the district's proposal. Another thing is that 92% of them agree with the teacher union's proposal of returning the 30-minute morning preps that they took during the longer school day negotiations back in 2012. And so the question is, or the question becomes, what is the district doing in our names and how are they able to do this? That we should be, if you have a policy, if a legislator passes a policy or if the school district passes a policy, who do they give it to implement in a school? They give it to principals. Principals are in a strategic position. We are the only people in the system who see the entire school level impact of the policies passed by legislatures and school boards. Yet our voices are absent, at least at the CPS table, when these policies are being developed. I talked to Mayor Lori Lightfoot before she became mayor, a couple of days before she was elected. And I told her about the district's practice of running in-runs around the Principals Association, not looking and listening to that representative voice. And she assured me that she would stop that practice. But as of yet, that practice or that promise has not been met.
Now, the district did respond to the survey saying, quote, Chicago Public Schools deeply values our principals, which is why we ask them to participate in negotiations to provide the essential perspective of school leaders on critical issues. We will continue to include diverse voices and perspectives in the negotiating process as we work to reach a contract with the union. What's your reaction to that?
So if you're going to say you have representative principal voice, you need three criteria, maybe even four, but at least three. The first one is that the principals you say are being represented, the majority of them have to have a say in selecting the people who are representing them at the table. So they failed on that regard. The second requirement, there must be a process for the people at the table to get feedback from the people they're allegedly representing. They have failed in that regard. Number three, there has to be an environment in which the people at the table don't feel like there will be repercussions if they disagree with the positions of their managers at the district. And you are a journalist, you've tried to reach out to principals. Get every journalist who's ever done education in Chicago at this table and ask them what are principals' responses like when they reach out to them to get a comment on a district policy. And what they will tell you is that 99.9% of the time, it's fear. And so they failed on that third criteria. The only organization in this city, and the fourth one would be they need to include assistant principals as well. And the only organization, the only institution in this city that meets all four of those criteria is the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association. But the district has failed time and time again to benefit from the value of the perspective that we bring to the table.
How many of the district's principals would you say the CPAA represents?
About 60%.
Okay. So is it possible then that the city included principals from the other 40% at the table? So
CPAA members were at the table, right? I think 5 of the 6 were at the table. The point is that they weren't at the table in the sense of having contributed to the policy. When they finally gave me the list, and that was a story about how I finally got the list for another day, when they finally gave me the list, I reached out to those principals. They came to the table after the district had already created this proposal and put it, so they didn't have any input in the proposal. They were brought in by the district to give examples of how they use prep time so that they can sell this proposal to CTU. So you can't say that principals were at the table there. You can't say that they were on the bargaining team.
So to give viewers an idea of what happens in this prep time, what kind of work do teachers do? Sometimes it is self-directed and sometimes it is principal-directed?
Once per week, you get a principal-directed. 4 times per week, it's self-directed. Principal-directed time was one of the key things that we used at Blaine to make it the #1 neighborhood school in the city. So principal-directed time is important, but equally important is teachers' ability to have self-directed time to plan lessons, collaborate together, parent contacts, grade papers. They need that time. And so what our members have said, at least 70% of them, is that we like it the way it is. I would also say that the 24% that didn't had some valuable insights in terms of why they did support the district's proposal. And those insights should be listened to and addressed in a way that doesn't force this proposal on 70% of the folks who don't want it.
So if teachers do strike, and as we just heard, support staff may be striking as well, what's the impact going to be on principals and administrators who in previous instances, the 2012 strike and the plan was for the 2016 strike that did not happen, what is the impact going to be on principals and administrators who have to keep the buildings open?
I would say this, that sort of look back in context. When they were about to strike in 2015, 2016, we did a survey of our members to see if they supported, that strike was averted. But we did a survey of our members, and 80% of them supported the teacher striking for the issues that they were about to strike for. What that tells me is that principals have a short-term view and a long-term view in terms of if we strike, students are going to lose, well, actually they won't lose any days, but days will be added on until the end of the year, but there'll be a delay there. Long-term, what are the issues at stake? Class size is at stake here. Staffing is at stake here. We're in the most understaffed school district in the state of Illinois. And so the teachers are saying, let's address that. And so the long-term health in terms of the conditions students learn under are at stake here. And so principals want to see those long-term conditions addressed. And if it takes a strike to do that, several of them, not all of them, but a majority of them, at least in the past, have shown that they support it.
All right, Troy LaRaviere, Chicago Principals and Administrators Association, thank you so much for joining us again. A show of historical photographs shines light on a dark chapter of World War II. When the Nazis made a ghetto in the central Polish city of Lodz, one man trapped inside took thousands of pictures. He had an official capacity as an ID photographer, but he risked his life to take other photos that documented the truth. Here's Paris Schutz.
At the Illinois Holocaust Museum, there are unexpected snapshots of happy couples, families, and people trying to live normal lives in traumatic situations. There are propaganda photographs showing the lie that everything was all right in the Lodge Ghetto, where Jews were working in leather and mattress factories for the German war effort. And there are secretly taken photos that reveal the terrifying reality. The pictures were taken by this man, Henrik Ross.
He was officially, as a statistics photographer, he photographed identification photos for people. He was able to stockpile films from there. And he had to do official photography for the German propaganda because, of course, the goal was to show that Lodge Ghetto was, in fact, a profitable undertaking.
There are many images about the Holocaust that many of us know, many of the liberation camp images. It is maybe confusing to people to see that there are dinner parties and dances, but these are also in the earlier years of the Lodge Ghetto. But people needed to continue living, and so they had marriages and they had babies and they had celebration. These are expressions of hope and resilience. He gave people dignity in the portraiture that he took of them, and the people smiled back.
In the Lodge Ghetto, 160,000 Jews were segregated and isolated. The numbers swelled to more than 200,000, including Roma people.
All the Jews were rounded up. They had to move out of their own homes. Were allowed to take maybe a suitcase or just a few possessions. There was a huge sign outside that, warned people that this is Jews only. You couldn't enter the ghetto.
As the situation became increasingly dire, Henrik Ross and his wife documented the deprivation and the deportations to death camps. When the ghetto was almost completely liquidated, he buried his negatives.
He and his wife Stefania were chosen to be part of the crew that stayed in the ghetto, cleaned up the ghetto, and that is how he survived.
Near the end of the war, he returned and unearthed his archive. Half of the 6,000 images were destroyed. Others were badly damaged. In 1961, Henrik Ross testified at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and his photographs were entered into the record.
You mean you saw people being shot and beaten when they refused to enter the train?
There was a hole in the plank, and I photographed through that hole.
Ross said that the pictures showed a record of our tragedy, a historical record of martyrdom. This touring exhibition came from the Art Gallery of Ontario. It concludes with a collage of images the photographer made many years later when he tried to process his experience. It is a puzzle of memory.
It's a good puzzle to have in the end, too, because it shows the artist trying to grapple with his own past and what he lived through.
It took him all those years to deal with that trauma.
These are very complicated stories on how people survived.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Paris Schutz.
Henrik Ross died in 1991 in Israel. The exhibition of his photographs is called Memory Unearthed. It just opened at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education in Skokie and runs until January 12th, and you can see more of those photos on our website. And we're back with Paris Schutz and a look at a new project from entrepreneur Elon Musk right after this.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
Tesla and SpaceX founder Elon Musk wants to carry passengers to Mars and beyond, and he thinks that day could come sooner rather than later. He recently unveiled a prototype spacecraft in Texas as part of his plan to create a fleet of reusable rockets that will make space travel dramatically cheaper and may one day make humans a truly spacefaring civilization. But can Musk turn what has long been science fiction into fact? Joining us is Don Lincoln, particle physicist at Fermilab, science communicator, and a space exploration enthusiast. Don Lincoln, welcome back to Chicago Tonight.
And thank you for having me.
Okay, so explain to us what Elon Musk's latest unveiling is, the Starship X.
Well, what he's done is he's unveiled a spaceship which he hopes will be able to carry a bunch of people to Mars. A few big things about it is it's made of steel instead of carbon fiber, which makes it less expensive. And the idea is to keep it inexpensive so that it's usable.
And we're looking at his prototype right here. He thinks that the critical thing here is to make space travel like air travel. How so, and is that realistic?
Well, it's not going to be like air travel. I mean, it cost me $300 to fly from Chicago to LA, so it's going to be more than that. But the idea is to make it much less expensive. Is it possible? Well, certainly to make it less expensive than the way it's been done before. But no, not like air travel.
But the key is to have a reusable rocket. And explain how he plans to do that.
Well, he's done things like this before. It's absolutely amazing. He'll shoot a rocket into space, first the booster and then the second tiers of it, and then they come down and they land just like coming down with fire coming out of their back, and it's great. The reason they do that is very simple, because imagine if every time you took a flight from here to someplace, you had to buy a new plane for every single one. His idea, which is clearly the way to go, is if you can reuse the rocket, then you reduce the price.
How many times do you think the rocket could be reused?
He'll tell you it's 20 or 30 times. And of course, that's an engineering question, which they'll figure out as they build it.
And the other thing here is the weight of the rocket. And you mentioned the fact that it's made of steel. It's 120 tons. How does that compare to the normal rocket ship?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, rockets are bigger and smaller, right? Some are very small. If you compare it to the Saturn V rockets that shot us to the moon, this particular rocket that he has right now is smaller. It is planned, however, to have as much as double the thrust of the Saturn rocket. So in principle, it could lift off with twice the capability of the moon launches.
And he says he plans to have test flights with this rocket within the next few months. How realistic is that?
Well, it is certainly ambitious. I mean, he is nothing if not aggressive. The plan, according to what he announced, was that in a couple of months to lift this particular rocket up to about 60,000 feet, so call it 12 miles, and bring it back down. And then he's talking about orbital flights in 6 months. I wish him all the luck. I think that's probably optimistic.
What is his ultimate goal? Is it leisure trips? Is it research trips? Is it to hope to have NASA purchase some of these?
Well, it's a combination. I mean, I think what he really wants is to simply put outposts of humanity on Mars. I mean, he wants humanity to leave the bounds of Earth and go forth into first the solar system and then the stars. It's a truly noble goal.
And there's certain hurdles here, I mean, beyond the obvious. So if someone is going to be traveling to Mars and spending all that time in the ship, there's the gravitational force, and then there's radiation. So how do you mitigate those problems?
Well, this is something he's going to have to deal with. When we sent people to the moon 50 years ago, it was a gamble. If there was a solar flare or something, it would have killed the people. So he's going to have to happen is come up with some way to shield people from this radiation. Probably the way that we do it, I would guess, is to take a small area, very tight, with very thick walls. And so when radiation from the sun comes from a solar flare, which doesn't happen all the time, but if it does, that thick material will stop the radiation and protect people for the duration of the flare. When the flare is gone, then they'd be able to come out.
But this would make the rocket ship heavier then?
Yes, and it's always a trade-off. I mean, you have to decide how much you're willing to gamble. The predictions are, if they're lucky and there's no serious solar flare pointed in the direction of the ship, that astronauts going from here to Mars in the course of their trip will get half of the maximum allowed lifetime radiation for an astronaut. And if they're unlucky, it'll be much worse.
And how does this work out financially? I mean, how does he plan to make this financially feasible?
Well,
because I assume it's fairly expensive to operate.
Well, there's a couple of things. Of course, he's funding a lot of it himself. He has investors. He's very charismatic, and he's got people who are interested in doing that. He has a Japanese investor who wants to take that individual and a bunch of artists on a trip around the moon. And if you have people with big pockets and they're fascinated in space travel, he'll talk to them and get them to help him.
I'm sure there's a few out there. So what do you think about this focus on creating an outpost on Mars and putting all these billions of dollars in resources toward this goal?
Well, it depends. I mean, some people have this vision that all of a sudden it will be a place we can move to in the same way that the Europeans left Europe and went to America or Australia or something like that. And I don't see that happening. I mean, it's just incredibly expensive to bring that many people there. But the reasons we might go there might be geopolitical or potentially scientific. If we find evidence for extinct life on Mars, we might want to send scientists there to study it. I mean, I can see reasons to do that. I don't see it being a place where a huge number of people will move and settle in the way that people kind of hope it might happen.
All right, Don Lincoln, more to come. Thank you so much.
And thank you for having me.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Paris, thank you. 23 Chicago public schools have received free art collections since the beginning of the school year. That's thanks to Chicago nonprofit I Paint My Mind, which is dedicated to art education. Our arts correspondent, Angel Edo, explains how the nonprofit is able to provide these collections with the help of their art subscription concept.
What's that?
Nonprofit I Paint My Mind wants to make sure art is accessible for all students. So they created an art subscription program with the help of local artists and corporate partners.
The Shared Walls program is what we call it, where we lease art to clients, then use those funds to put art galleries in schools. We've been in every ward in the city, over 70 community art exhibitions throughout Chicago, and that's been in 5 years.
The nonprofit purchases art collections from local artists to lease to those clients or hang in schools. They've developed a large collection that currently totals 1,300 prints. One of those collections hangs in Fulton Galley, a food hall in the West Loop. Together, the food hall and the nonprofit curated their walls with sneakers by local artist All Star Press. About 80% of those artists are local, including visual artist Greg Galindo Rosa. Rosa's latest collection for the nonprofit can be seen hanging on the walls of Northwest Middle School. It's a Chicago version of the Mexican game Loteria.
Why did you name that pan dulce instead of the concha?
Good question. I always think about that too, and you're the first person to ask me that.
Like the nonprofit, Rosa also wants to make all types of art accessible for all students.
Knowing that the youth can see my art in their school and then also feel a tie to it or feel like I understand this or just, makes sense to me, that's really important.
Having the artwork here, I'll be able to bring my students down to see the art in their school instead of going to a gallery, which is incredible. They'll be able to see this art here, and then we'll be able to go back upstairs, talk about it, and create art in our art classroom based on the art that we're seeing here.
Teachers say they're grateful for these collections because they want to remind their students that forming opinions about art is an opportunity they deserve.
It brings dignity to our school too, and our kids are seen and they feel important because this is here and it's about them.
With a goal of providing free collections for schools for at least 4 years, the nonprofit says they want to partner with people who want to be a part of their Get Art, Give Art concept.
Bringing these art galleries and programs to every CPS school is something we would love to see happen over the next couple of years, and making sure that our art collection reflects the communities we serve. For us, it's really important that the dialogue around curation is something that happens with the partner or the client, that the art isn't an imposition but really fits into the fabric of the community in some way.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Edo.
The schools also receive art curriculum to go along with the collection, as well as a workshop with the artist of the collection held at the end of the school year. There's more on this story on our website. She was one of the greatest singers in the history of American opera. Jessye Norman died yesterday at 74. A groundbreaker herself, Norman credited singers like Marian Anderson and Leontyne Price for helping her overcome racial barriers and become a star. 5 years ago, Norman joined us here on Chicago Tonight to talk about her just-released biography. Here she is talking about how she got her start.
truly, I've been singing since as long as I can remember. I have no memory of not singing. And I remember being about 7 years old and singing for my entire school body, about 1,200 kids. And I was selected only because I could sing really loudly, not because it was beautiful.
But it had to take shape.
Well, yes, and I participated in the choirs at the church and at the school and Brownies and Girl Scouts. And so I sang really as much, I think, when I was growing up as I do now.
The late opera star Jessye Norman back in 2014 on Chicago Tonight. You can watch the full interview on our website. Before we go, some viewer feedback. A new ordinance has been introduced in City Council that would put limits on backyard livestock in Chicago. Some of you chimed in. There's a rooster or two on the next block north of me, and I'm glad I'm no closer. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to sleep in. Registering a chicken, I can almost understand, but requiring people to send written notification to all neighbors within 500 feet before getting a pet chicken? Let's first improve CPS, then the budget, then infrastructure, then insert the next 1,000 more important things, then chicken coops. Maybe get rid of the rats first. And before there was 3D printing, there was Mold-A-Rama, Chicago's very own souvenir machine. For many of you, this was a trip down memory lane, especially when it came to the smell of the souvenirs. I can smell that video. The smell of my childhood. I remember with fondness the smell and anxiously awaiting the dolphin, monkey, or polar bear to come out of the machine. My favorite memory of the zoos and museums. Kudos to Bill and Paul Jones for continuing to keep the tradition alive all these years, causing, I'm sure, so many other kids to have the same experience of wonder and excitement that I had. As always, we appreciate hearing from you. Join the discussion on Facebook and Twitter or post your comments on our website. And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. The votes are in, but exactly when might the Chicago Teachers Union walk out on strike? And the history behind one of Chicago's most recognizable pieces of public art in this week's Ask Jeffrey. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, serving Chicago as a personal injury law firm since 1984.